Okay, so now let's take a look, or a closer look, at using intervals in chords in various ways. The basic point of this whole section of the course is limiting intervals. Any kind of coherent harmony requires limitation. If you do all intervals and all notes all the time, the result is just gray. Rather, like a painter using all colors all the time, the result is just dead. So we're looking at ways to limit the intervals in the harmony. There are many, many possible ways, but that's our focus here. Well, one way is to consider the way you distribute intervals in a chord. Okay, just a word about that before we go into the details. The idea of a chord presupposes blend. For example, this combined with this, I can call it a chord if I want, but there's really more a sense that I have something in the bottom and something on top because they're so separate. Okay, we'll talk more about using tone color to do that in a moment. That's the first thing. Another thing I wanted to point out is that there's an advantage to using chords with not too many different notes. One of the big advantages of the tonal system is you can double various notes of a 3 or 4 note chord, and it doesn't muddy up the texture. If you start getting into chords with 6 and 7 notes, it's easily very, very heavy. It easily becomes heavy. So chords with not too many intervals tend to keep the texture light, and they're a way to keep the tension for one special moment in the phrase. So we're going to be talking about various kinds of intervallic limitation for coherence and for focus. One way, there's a rather interesting method proposed in the Persichetti book, equidistant intervals. Let's listen to example 6. What we see in example 6 is harmony in 3 notes made of equidistant intervals. In other words, each chord consists of the same interval twice. Minor 7th, minor 7th, perfect 4th, perfect 4th, minor 7th, minor 7th, major 3rd, and so on. Okay? This is a special kind of mirror harmony about which we're going to see a few words later. Okay, this particular kind of mirror harmony has the advantage because it's only 3 note chords, and because each chord has only one kind of interval between adjacent notes, it tends to give you the possibility of having something that's very harmonically coherent, but also can give a lot of variety, because we can use all the different intervals, just not at the same time in the same chord. So as you can see here, we have sevenths, we have fourths, we have thirds, we have fifths. Okay, that gives us a lot of variety in what we can do, and at the same time, overall, the piece doesn't sound like it's just overflowing with too many different kinds of interval characters. So that's quite useful. The other thing we can do is, when you have various qualities of the same interval, for example, major second and minor second, or perfect 4th and augmented 4th, as long as the sound is limited to 1 or 2 intervals, and I consider the perfect 4th and augmented 4th to be 2 different intervals, as long as that, we still can get a fair amount of focus. And we'll be talking about those, in fact, in the next couple of lessons, about harmony in fourths and harmony by seconds. So more about that next time. Then we also have the issue of mixing intervals. Well, obviously, a lot of harmony has mixed intervals, okay? But there are ways to mix them that are not totally overwhelming to the listener. One thing is the issue of density. How many different intervals are there in the chord? Specifically, how many intervals between adjacent notes, especially. If there's tremendous variety, again, it gets gray very fast. So chords that have great variety of intervals and many notes tend to be, or should be, used with reserve. They tend to be special effects and not something you want to go on for a very long time. Also, we can group chords into families. Remember how we talked about interval tension and tension characteristics? Well, we could do something like example 7a. If you look at example 7a, that has major second, minor 6th, minor 7th. Those are intervals that are either gentle consonances or gentle dissonances. So there's no real bite in that chord. Okay, that chord, even though it has some variety of intervals, isn't especially aggressive. If you compare example 7b, that's a little stronger, because here we have the interval between the D flat and the C and the outer voices makes a major 7th. So that gives a little more tension than 7a did, or for that matter, more than 7b, the second example, which again has no minor second or major 7th anywhere. So by limiting the intervals in these ways, we can still give certain characters to to the chord, or a certain definite character to a chord or a passage, okay, without at the same time having to limit ourselves so extremely that it becomes impossible to find anything useful. Another thing to notice about this situation, here we'll look at example 7C, is that there are ways to make even harsh intervals softer. Look at the first chord in 7C. Here's the same chord, but I'm adding an E. The thing is, the E is consonant with the G on top, and it's also consonant with the A flat on the bottom. Result, instead of this, we now hear, tends to round it off a little bit. Same thing in the second half of that bar. Here's the original again. Now I add a major sixth underneath, but that note is also consonant with the D and the G. Result is considerably richer than that by itself. Okay? So even if you have a chord with a rough dissonance in it, provided it's not doubled, if you add some consonances in relation to that note or other notes in the chord, you can soften up or enrich the chord. That's a useful thing to keep in mind. Another thing to notice is that the way the tritone can be used. If you have harmony which is generally not very tense, let's look at the first chord in 7D. That's a minor third, major second, and the outer voices make a fourth. Compare there, the tritone D flat at G, which also makes a minor second with the C, gives the second chord a lot more punch than the first one. So two similar chords, but not similar in effect at all. Okay, then we have the issue of what notes do we double. So far we've talked about chords without any doubling, but as you can recall from traditional harmony, doubling is quite useful a lot of the time. Well, in harmony with a lot of different notes or various different intervals, sometimes a doubling is a good way to make a cadence. Let's listen to example 8. In example 8, the first chord and the second chord are each made up of completely different intervals, no doubling. When we get that octave between the outer parts in the last chord of example 8, there's a sense of resolution. Again, notice the definite feeling of coming into resolution at the last chord. Doubling can also be used to emphasize things in a chord. For example, if you look at the first chord in example 9, here the dissonance, the strongest dissonance, is between G sharp and A. But if I double one of those two notes, namely the G sharp on top, it emphasizes the dissonant character of the chord. Now look at the second chord in example 9. Okay. Here, I'm doubling a different note. It's actually the same notes as the first one, but now instead of doubling the G sharp, I'm doubling the E. Generally much richer then, because in the first one I doubled the dissonant element, and the second one I doubled the consonant element. These things are good to keep in mind, because what they do is they give you ways to moderate interval tension within a phrase or within a short section of the piece, even if it's all within one kind of harmony. Another way to control tension and overall sort of density of harmony is what Persichetti calls coupling. Coupling means you have the same chords, for example, in example 10, in each hand. Let's listen to example 10. As we can see, the right hand here and the left hand are exactly the same, just separated by an octave or two. The result is, although there are a lot of notes, there aren't that many different pitches. So it gives a kind of thickness of harmony, but without it becoming overly dense. The last thing we want to think about in this part of the class is the influence of orchestration. Obviously, if I put a dissonance into two instruments of the same kind, say two oboes, it's going to strike you more than if I put a dissonance into two different instruments. For example, I have an oboe and a violin. It won't be as blended as two oboes, so the result is going to be a rather different perception of the dissonance. If we listen to example 11a, here we have the trumpet on the top playing a note that's dissonant to the string chord below. Well, the contrasting colors help us to perceive the two things as separate, so you're not as inclined to hear the trumpet as a strong dissonance with the strings. Let's compare example 11b. 11b has the same tone color. So we notice the dissonance more because it's all in the same plane of tone. It's not that 11A has no dissonance whatsoever, it's just it's attenuated by the difference in tone colors. The last thing I want to say about orchestration is that some timbres sound just generally more dissonant than others. For example, an oboe in 7 sounds more dissonant than flutes. A triad and 3 loud trumpets can sound pretty harsh. Let's listen to example 11C to see that. As we can hear, just the richness in the overtones to the trumpet sound creates a kind of accent and brilliantness to the sound.